Today on episode 81, I interview Cody Miller, who is an assistant professor in New York, and we have an enlightening discussion about LGBTQ issues in education. The reason why I have Cody come on the show is I wanted to explore how teachers can support the LGBTQ community within our schools and our classrooms. Even though it's 2019 and it seems like there would be more acceptance and inclusion of LGBTQ people, there is still a lot of work to do. So in part one of my interview with Cody, we discuss what has and hasn't improved with schools, how cisgender and hetero educators can support their queer colleagues and students, and how to address those that don't approve of the LGBTQ community.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, where we help new and beginning teachers navigate through those crazy first years of teaching so you can maintain your sanity and personal life. Here's your host, Kim Lapre.
Welcome to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kim Lapre, and this is the podcast for new and beginning teachers who don't want to just survive those first few years, but actually thrive. I'm so excited to have you guys here today. Thank you so much for joining me. I have a fabulous episode with Cody Miller, who is so smart and witty, and I really enjoyed having this conversation with him. But before I dive into it, I wanted to remind you about the upcoming New Educator Weekend conferences in San Diego and Santa Clara, California. If you are a new teacher, and pretty much most of you are, it is the podcast for new teachers, then you definitely want to make it a priority to attend one of these conferences. They will be packed with hands-on sessions that are curated just for new teachers to help you with your first few years of teaching. So just imagine like this podcast broken up into different sessions, but it's in person. And while you're there, you can get university credit for attending, which I know is important when you're trying to move up the pay scale. I remember always trying to get as many of these credits as I could. And plus, I'll be holding a session on giving effective feedback, and I would absolutely love to see you there. It would be so much fun to meet up and grab a bite to eat or just say hi. So head on over to teachersneedteachers.com/conference to sign up for either the Southern one, which is from December 6th through the 8th, or the Northern one, which is from February 21st to the 23rd.
Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Glenn from the On Education Podcast. And we're part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Cody Miller is an assistant professor of English education at the College at Brockport, State University of New York. Prior to that, he taught high school English for 7 years in Florida. His teaching and research focus on the various ways students construct their identities in ELA classrooms, with a specific emphasis on how young adult literature influences students' worldviews and meaning-making capacities. He's also led professional development sessions that focus on writing instruction and developing inclusive spaces for LGBTQ students. And currently, he is the chair of the National Council of Teachers of English, or NCTE, LGBTQ Advisory Committee. Cody was awarded the Teaching Tolerance Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2016, and recognized as one of the International Literacy Association's 30 Under 30 in 2019. So now that you know more about Cody, here's my conversation with him. Cody, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here.
Now, you've done some work with teaching tolerance. In fact, you even received an award, and now you're working with the National Council of Teachers of English on LGBTQ issues. So can you talk about this important role that you have within both of the groups?
Sure. So for teaching tolerance, I was awarded their teaching award back in 2016. And since then, I've been working on their advisory board. So on that board, teaching tolerance's mission is pretty broad, right? And it includes all grades and content areas. So it takes a very generalist approach to education. The stuff I particularly focus on for teaching tolerance and what I've written is by and large discussing LGBTQ topics in classes, as well as looking at kind of the politics of education and what's happening in schools based on what's happening in our broader political atmosphere. And I would say that teaching tolerance in general is much more like broadly focused, right? So they have like a best guides for supporting LGBTQ youth that spans K-12 and all content areas, including administrators as well. So really kind of a holistic view of schools. So that's kind of my work. That's my work there. Whereas NCTE is more focused on English teachers, of course, and that spans K-12, including higher ed, but it is really focused on English as a subject area, which is what my background is in. So I'm the chair of the LGBTQ Advisory Committee, which is a committee dedicated to looking at how do we support LGBTQ youth, families, and communities within English language arts? How do we make English classes affirming spaces for LGBTQ youth? And the big work I've been doing on that this year is once a month, a member from the committee writes a blog piece for NCTE that shares insight and practices for how to make affirming spaces in English class for LGBTQ youth. So that's been a lot of the work that I've been doing this year with that organization.
And is that beyond just including more inclusive texts? Are we talking about just like teaching strategies in general?
Yeah, I mean, obviously texts are such an important part, right? But it does go beyond just text, right? Because it also includes how do we make space for talking about LGBTQ identities in writing instruction, for instance. How can we talk about not just LGBTQ identities, but also things like heteronormativity and cisnormativity and all of these ideologies that harm LGBTQ people? How can we talk about those systems in any text, right? So I say that you could easily use, Lord of the Flies, which is a canonical text that a lot of schools have, to talk about things like toxic masculinity, right? And how manhood and masculinity gets tied up to violence, and how does that harm people? So texts obviously are super important, and my heart is in young adult literature. However, it's more than just text, right? It's also things like writing instruction, the language and procedures we use in classrooms. Beyond just text, though, my heart will always be with text.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of times when we're analyzing literature, we do talk about gender roles, but it's always heteronormative gender roles. It's also always, how are men supposed to behave? How are women supposed to behave? But there's not a whole lot in the middle when we have these conversations, at least for a while. And a lot has changed and stayed the same, I feel like, in school since you and I were in middle school or high school in terms of LGBTQ awareness and issues. So I'm just curious, what have been the most positive changes that you've seen, and what have been the biggest disappointments?
Yeah, so I think a number of things on the positive front, right? So the fact that we now have so much LGBTQ representations in books and curricular material, right? It seems like I cannot keep up with the rapidity of how LGBTQ young adult literature is coming out. In fact, I was at a bookstore the other day, and as I was looking through the YA section, I was like, here's 5 books that came out in the past few months that I haven't read. And part of my job is reading these books and knowing these books. So that's really good that there's so much variety, and there's more curricular materials being made for LGBTQ youth, which is, I think, obviously a step in the positive direction. Also, just in general, schools don't exist in vacuums. So changes that we have in society and culture, they eventually bring changes in school, right? So, we know from lots of studies that millennials and Gen Z's views on LGBTQ topics are just in general more progressive than previous generations. And that if you look at polling, there kind of is an emerging consensus among millennials and Gen Z that LGBTQ people deserve dignity and deserve rights. And so obviously when you have, a group of an emerging generation that eventually is going to enter teaching, then they bring their views about LGBTQ folks to their teaching, right? So I think that's a really positive change as well. But there are some disappointments, right? Because we know that support for LGBTQ rights, it doesn't always seamlessly translate into incorporation of LGBTQ curricular material. There's some research by Amanda Thine and Paula Greyhouse that shows that even teachers who say, like, I support LGBTQ rights, I support, all these kind of big political issues that get talked about in the news, that doesn't necessarily mean that they then go and use LGBTQ material in their classroom, right? So there's still a divide between the political views of some teachers and their actual pedagogy. And then I think the other disappointment is that we know that this is kind of common throughout American history, that whenever a marginalized group begins to gain rights, there's always pushback. So while it seems that, no one it's very rare to hear even talks about marriage equality anymore, right? Like after the Obergefell decision, suddenly all the people who spent years and years and years saying that gay people getting married will destroy the foundation of America, just gave that up, right? Like, oh, just kidding. I guess that wasn't the case, because it didn't become politically salient or a way to, it didn't become a socially acceptable form of hate, right? But there are new forms of socially acceptable forms of hate, right? So you see this on, you see the attack on trans students' basic rights to use a restroom, right? I think that that's become the new battleground that anti-LGBTQ politicians have chose to stake out and make the battleground. Because once a consensus emerges among the population, it's hard to push against that consensus. So you find like the next area that can be exploited to gin up support for anti-LGBTQ votes.
It's, for so many, especially in conservative areas, it's still a really tough time for those students. And, luckily, I am in a more progressive state, but I'm going to be completely transparent here that I'm probably one of more of those disappointments, because I completely support the community, but I have not done my share in terms of just including it in the conversation. I think because of my own discomfort and not knowing, and I guess you could call it my ignorance. And there's a lot of acceptance. You had mentioned Gen Z, and there's a lot of acceptance right now. I can see it in my middle schoolers. There are a lot of girls, especially, who are beginning to wonder if they are bi or trans. And, we have a really strong GSA at my school, and a lot of them are going there. And I started thinking, this is really important to them. So I feel like in order to really say that I support it and walk the walk, I have to do this. So I'm really interested to hear, as we continue our conversation, about ways that people like me who, yes, we support it, but we haven't done our share, can do that. And, it does personally upset me, though, that there's so few states that have protections for LGBTQ in our schools and workplaces. I think there's like 13.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I mean, that's ridiculous. So why do you think it's taking so long for the other 30 plus states to get on board? I mean, if my state doesn't have such protections, let's say that I am in one of those 30 plus states. Also, what are my options if I am LGBTQ?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that it's taking so long for the other 30 states to get on board is that there's a lot of misconceptions, right? So if you look at the polling, most Americans support protections for LGBTQ people, and they believe those protections already exist, right? So there's some polling that shows most Americans think that that already is law, right? And it's not.
Of course it is, right?
Right. And in fact, this year, the the House, right, passed the Equality Act, which is federal legislation that would protect LGBTQ people from employment discrimination. It's dead on arrival. The Republican-controlled Senate has said they won't touch it. Donald Trump has said he won't sign it. So it's dead on arrival for now, right? But it's 2019 and that just passed. But there's this conception that like those protections already exist. And I think that part of that is we have a narrative in this country that inevitable progress, right? We're always moving forward. So we had Obergefell, the Supreme Court decision in 2015 that said same-sex marriage equality is legal. What we don't talk about is that LGBTQ teachers can get married on Sunday and then fired on Monday, right? So that's an important part of the conversation that often has been kind of left out in the bigger marriage equality talk. The other thing is that the Supreme Court will more than likely soon take up the question of is it constitutional to fire someone for being LGBTQ? And I mean, there are 5 justices that are very hostile to LGBTQ rights and 4 that are pro LGBTQ rights. And I'm not a math teacher. 4 is less than 5, right?
So, and one is barely hanging on.
And one is barely hanging on, right? So I think that if the court takes that case and then rules in favor against LGBTQ people, not only will that be devastating, I think it's going to be a shock to so many Americans who are not part of the LGBTQ community, because they're going to assume that like, oh, like what, right? Like I thought that there's already protection. So I think that one of the most important things you can do is educate yourself and vote, right? And register people to vote. There was an LGBTQ presidential town hall, last week where a number of candidates, in the Democratic primary, not all candidates, but a number of candidates came in and talked about their agenda, and they were asked questions. And it's telling that the Department of Education and the Department of Justice were 2 agencies that constantly came up during that town hall, because those 2 agencies have really broad power, right, that can harm or support LGBTQ people in schools, right? So it was Betsy DeVos and Jeff Sessions who overturned Loretta Lynch and Arnie Duncan's trans support for trans students within public schools. So there's just so much power in those executive agencies that I think it's easy when we're thinking about like laws for LGBTQ people, and we get caught up in like these big celebratory court cases, it's easy to forget the like minutia of executive action. But what can you do if your state doesn't protect you? So check your local district, because lots of, we know that within quote unquote progressive states, there are non-progressive areas, and then the inverse is true, right? In quote unquote non-progressive states, there are progressive areas. So I think one thing is to check your school district and to check your county, because lots of kind of more progressive areas within more conservative states typically have passed laws that protect LGBTQ people. So I taught for 7 years in Florida. Florida is a state that has not passed protection for LGBTQ people, but the county I was in had passed it. So there is some, kind of local versus state government there.
Little pockets there.
Little pockets, yeah. And I think that's something to be aware of. That's really important. But again, I think the most important thing we can do is vote, talk about these issues, register people to vote. I think that that's super important, because I wish I could say I'm optimistic about the Supreme Court, but I would be lying.
Right. Well, yeah, especially like you said, it's imbalanced right now. And would you ever recommend that someone move out of an anti-LGBTQ area if they identify? I'm just curious, like, would you personally not teach in an area that's hostile?
Well, it's complicated, right? So I don't want to.
I mean, just from your perspective, you're not prescribing, but for you personally, as a teacher, would you venture into an area that is hostile and just stay closeted? Or do you see what I mean?
For sure. So before I answer that, I want to kind of complicate something really quickly, though, that
Okay.
the area of the country that has the highest amount of same-sex parents, if the numbers still hold true, I need to look into this, but it used to be actually the South. So the area that was most hostile to LGBTQ people in terms of legislation actually was the area that like most LGBT same-sex couples raising children were, right? So life is messy, life is complicated.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, you think about the South and like Atlanta, right? Atlanta is in Georgia, but Atlanta is like a very progressive city, right? In the way that kind of metropolitan areas are. So to answer your question, my first year that I taught in Florida was a pretty homophobic area, both in terms of the local politics, but also the school. And I only taught there a year, and a reason was I didn't feel not only there was this thing where like no one wanted, like it was hard for the school to recruit teachers because it was a really small rural area, so it was just hard to get people to apply. So I didn't really worry about losing my job because like no one, like they were having a hard time recruiting teachers anyway, right? But I didn't feel comfortable and I didn't feel like I could be myself. And I think that so I left. I mean, I also had kids, one or two kids who were LGBTQ and came out to me, and like I became, a space for them to talk. And I think that's super important. I grew up in an area in North Florida that was very small and rural, and there was no like LGBTQ educators or even LGBTQ kids. So I come from an area like that. But yeah, I left after a year because I kind of felt like I couldn't kind of keep the mental stamina to bifurcate myself at the school.
Right. And I'm sure there are a lot of, especially new ones, because, tenure is important when you're making these types of decisions. Some teachers might be afraid to even talk about it because of lack of tenure. Or let's say you work at a charter school and there is no tenure. So, I was just curious about that. And for me personally, as a cisgender straight woman, how can I support my LGBTQ students? Like, what can I do to make them feel like they belong, other than putting up, like a flag or putting little signs that say this is safe space? I mean, something more meaningful, especially since a lot of them still seem to be figuring it out and are scared of what people will think.
Yeah. Can I go back to your last question really quick though?
Yeah.
Because I think not even thinking about, because you had mentioned if you don't have tenure or if you're at a charter school that doesn't offer it, but Florida is a quote unquote right to work state, right? So there's no option for teacher tenure in Florida. That was eviscerated back in 2010. Or 2011 after the 2010 midterm and all these hardcore right wingers took over various state governments. A lot of them eviscerated tenure. So for like most teachers in the South, like especially new teachers, tenure isn't even an option, right? And it's my belief, of course, that eviscerating tenure also made workspaces more hostile for queer people because at least if you have tenure, that's a level of protection.
Right.
And the way that if you don't even have that. So yeah, the number of states that just tenure is not even an option is also, I think, something that we always have to kind of ground in these conversations about protections for LGBTQ educators. So again, educate yourself and vote. I hope all listeners go and register like 5 friends to vote after this podcast at least, because I think that's how we're going to have to turn this ship around.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, sorry, your question, before I get on my soapbox about terrible legislation. So how can you make students still feel, how can you make them belong, right? So I think something that you had hinted at earlier is really knowing how your own dominant identities shape the way you think about the world and school and curriculum. Right. So how do identities how do straight and cis identities shape the way that you've experienced school, I think is the first place to start, because you first have to know how your own dominant identities have given you access to power within a school that LGBTQ folks would not have access to. I think ensuring LGBTQ voices in curriculum is really important. if that means you can't do a whole, read aloud with an LGBTQ voice, but you can include them on your bookshelves, then that's a good start, right?
Right.
I think that always evaluating our language and procedures, right? So, for instance, if we say ladies and gentlemen, right, that's erasing people, non-binary folks, that's erasing anyone who doesn't fall strictly within that binary. So I'm from the South. I love a good y'all because y'all is very inclusive, right? So if we are in elementary school, not lining up boys and girls, right? Like that's really problematic. And so not doing that. I think that you had mentioned not just having a sticker, but I do think what is on your wall does communicate powerful ideas, right? Like, I think that it's really easy, especially in 2019, to say, like, what does a safe space sticker do? So what? But, like, we know that schools are inherently pretty harmful places to queer people. So sometimes a sticker just to say this space is like, we know it's not the most affirming, but like within this institution, I'm going to be an affirming person. I think that, I don't know, I think stickers are important. Like, obviously not just a sticker, but I think there is still value in having visibility to show that you support LGBTQ communities. And then lastly, I think, how do we communicate ideas about family, right? So if we only say, mom and dad, that excludes not just kids who come from LGBTQ families, but includes all sorts of kids and their family structures. So I think those are some kind of foundational steps to think about making our spaces affirming for LGBTQ youth.
And I think especially with the subject area that you and I teach, it's really easy to, like you had mentioned, include, I don't have to just have normal, like the canon, where it's male and female falling in love. There's a lot of areas where we can insert that, the LGBTQ voices. And I'm looking into that. So, I'm beginning my personal journey on this because I feel like it's taken, I've been teaching for 18 years. I feel like it's taken me long enough. And I have now an audience, and I would love them as new teachers to not wait this long, especially with the amount of resources that are out there. And I do have to admit, there weren't as many texts when I started teaching. I'm sure you know that, or I was looking at them through my gender normative eyes. So I didn't see that there could have been undertones, or we could have had the discussion about gender normativity. I didn't think outside the box that way. And so now that I am doing all this research and learning, it's like, wow, I could have even deeper conversations with my students.
Yeah. And I think that, a thing to always keep in the back of our minds is that by virtue of being teachers, in a way, we are, whether directly or indirectly, also kind of cultivating the next generation of teachers, right? So if a middle school student sees that you are using LGBTQ text, if they go on to be a teacher, they will already have a kind of a groundwork for what that could look like, right? And I think that's, I think it's so important that we talk about why it's important to include LGBTQ text for the affirmation of LGBTQ kids. I think it's also important to think about that when we do that, we're also showing the future generations of teachers, right? That like this is a foundation for it. And in a way, like hopefully it continues the process, right? And so eventually eventually it's not something that generations of teachers feel like they have to navigate to do this work.
Right. It's just normal because we're all having the conversation. And, of course, the utopian idea is that there isn't that separation anymore.
Yeah.
And so, okay, now on the flip side, there are still a lot of teachers, you and I know this, in the field that believe that being gay or transgendered is immoral, that there are, religious reasons for this. They think it's a mental health reason. They think it's a choice that we're making or that's perverted, which influences how much or how little they support our LGBTQ students. And while I can't change their minds, especially those that have been teaching a while, or tell them what to do, what can administrators do to make the entire school a safe place, knowing that there are these teachers that don't agree with it?
Yeah, so I think that to kind of preface an answer, I think that if we frame it as, do you believe all students deserve access to dignity in education? And if you think being LGBTQ is immoral, then your answer is that you don't think all students deserve dignity, right? And I think we just have to have that really hard conversation. And I've been with teachers who are like, that's an attack, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, the reality is schools are very hostile places to LGBTQ youth. You're either actively working to make them less hostile or you're part of the problem, right? And I think we just have to name that truth. To get to your question, though, I think there are a number of things administrators can do. So, for instance, holding LGBTQ affirming professional development. So administrators can start book clubs that use books that support LGBTQ youth. Administrators can bring in safe zone training, to help their faculty learn how to make their classroom safe spaces for LGBTQ youth. There's a number of readings from GLSEN and Teaching Tolerance that administrators can bring into faculty meetings. Administrators can change language on forms and procedures, right? So we had talked about language around family, right? Administrators can, from a top-down perspective, implement that kind of change. Administrators can make sure that in any communication to the community, they take a broad definition of family. They can support the creation of gay straight alliances, right? And not just support the creation of it, but actively advocate for it and talk about it, in their meetings with other principals, right? To show that, like, my school did this and here was what made it great, and like you should support your students in starting. And I think also advocate for LGBTQ curriculum. I think that there's an old quote in politics, right? Show me your budget, I'll show you your values. I don't remember who said it. It sometimes gets credited to Joe Biden, but I never want to quote Joe Biden. And he had plagiarized before, so he probably plagiarized it from someone. And so, but that's it, right? Show me where you're spending your money and I'll show you your values. So if you say that you support LGBTQ youth, we need some money to get some LGBTQ books in the classrooms. So I think there's a lot that administrators can do to make schools more affirming for LGBTQ youth. So it is, true that some teachers are going to be bigots, and that's really unfortunate. But that doesn't mean that the teacher who is like, oh, I support LGBTQ rights, but I don't know how to do this, will I get in trouble? Well, if you have an administrator saying, here's the professional development, that sends the signal that, you will not get in trouble, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's less about, in any kind of movement to recognize the humanity of marginalized folks, there's always going to be people on the margins who will never change, right? And I think that spending so much time on the folks on the margins is just not a good way to spend our capital. And instead we need to find where are the people who are supportive of this work, but just don't know how to do it, or maybe they're scared to do it. And how do we get them over that fear and show them how to do this work? I think that's where the energy should be. And administrators can play a really big role in that.
Isn't Cody awesome? I got so much out of just this first half of our conversation because Cody has a great way of discussing difficult topics in a way that really shines a light on the problem while also highlighting solutions. Before I go into my key takeaways, I wanted to define a couple of terms that Cody used that I didn't know about until just this year. And yep, I hate to admit that it took me this long, you guys. So first, he mentions heteronormativity, which is the assumption or attitude that heterosexuality is the norm or default sexual orientation. When we see the world and our classrooms through the eyes of heteronormativity, we're teaching that heterosexuality is normal and everything else is not. And then he also mentions cisnormativity, which is the assumption that your gender identity always matches your biological sex. And, in a similar fashion as heteronormativity, cisnormativity makes being trans or non-binary the exception or abnormal. It's the idea that if you see a girl, then that person must be female. You see a boy, they must be male. And I can tell you from experience that more and more of what I've experienced and seen in my classroom, I've seen that this assumption as false. And operating from this point of view is actually really harmful to those students. So here are my key takeaways from this conversation with Cody. First, I'm pretty ashamed that it's taken me so long to start addressing LGBTQ issues in my classroom. And despite being such a staunch supporter of LGBTQ rights, I thought that that was enough just to be vocal about their rights. And then I would just go back to my classroom and it would be business as usual. If I truly support those students, then I need to do more than just accept them. I need to change the narrative and how I run my classroom. So second, I can support my students by thinking about how my hetero and cisgender identity shapes the way I teach. Cody suggests some small but significant changes, such as including LGBTQ voices in the curriculum. And that could be as simple as having those types of books on your shelf or stories with LGBTQ characters. You can also change your language when addressing kids. So not saying ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, and also eliminating practices that involve sorting students based on gender. And finally, when addressing those that are opposed to members of the LGBTQ community, it's important to craft the narrative as being about the rights of students. If you believe that all students deserve an education, then whether or not they're straight or LGBTQ is a non-issue. An admin can step in and create a safe and affirming space in the school by having professional development that specifically addresses these issues. So Cody and I talked for nearly an hour, and I wanted to split up our conversation into two parts. So be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button right now, whatever device you're listening on. That way you won't miss out on the rest of the conversation next week. I've also put links for the articles and books that Cody mentions in the show notes, and I also have how you can connect with him. And finally, if you're loving this podcast and are interested in supporting it, please head on over to teachersneedteachers.com/support. For just $5 a month, you can help keep this podcast going with the valuable content that I know you've become addicted to. So thanks again for hanging out with me today, you guys. I hope you have a fabulous week.
Thanks for listening to the Teachers Need Teachers podcast. Love this episode? Head over to Apple Podcast or Google Play to subscribe, rate, and leave a review.